Back in 2020, Emma was a student in Duluth, Minnesota, and Liam was out in Oregon, and their spring breaks didn't line up that year, so Emma was going to come home one week, and Liam was going to come home the next week, which was kind of a bummer, but that's what it was. So Emma came home in early March. We had a great week with her, but as the week went on, there began to be these rumblings about stuff going on around the world, and maybe things were going to slow down or stuff was going to change. Nobody really knew what was happening. By the end of the week, her school had said, we're not reopening. So wherever you are, stay where you are. And then very shortly after that, Liam's school said, we're not reopening, so you can't stay here, which really put us in a dilemma because he was in Oregon. And so we were saying, well, let's get him home. But we didn't really want him to fly home. And we knew if his school didn't reopen, he was somehow going to have to get his car from Oregon to Michigan because he had an internship there for the summer. So we said, well, how are we going to get Liam's car home? There's really only one way to do that. So we rented a car and drove across the country. We said, Liam, meet us in Boise, Idaho. And that was about 6 hours from where he was. He didn't quite make it to Boise. We had to go a little past Boise, but we finally met up with him. Went back to Boise where we dropped our rental car off at the airport, and then the four of us piled into Liam's Honda Accord along with all of his college stuff and drove back across the country to Duluth, Minnesota where we could get Emma's car because it was still at the airport. And then we drove back and spent the next couple of months doing nothing except for just getting on Zoom calls with people because that's what all of us did for a couple of months back in 2020. At the end of that summer, Liam had to go back to school. We had to get his car back to Oregon. So again, the four of us piled into the Honda Accord, along with all of Liam's school stuff, and drove back across the country, which is kind of a funny thing for me to think about even now, that four adults riding in a Honda Accord across the country. Later that next summer, Emma decided to do one of her medical clinicals in Portland, so we loaded her car up, and you got it, drove across the country. Her next clinical was in Arizona. She drove from Portland to Arizona herself, but we flew out there, and you know what we did next? We drove across the country to get her car back here. Then she graduated from school and took a job in Portland, Oregon. So again, we loaded up the car and we drove across the country. I think my count was 6 times in 2.5 years we have driven across the country. And I'm going to tell you, it is a beautiful country that we live in, and I recommend to everybody to do this at least once because you really don't get a feel for how different it is as you go across the country. Avoid Kansas at all costs. Okay? Go north of it, go south of it, avoid Kansas at all costs. You've seen the first mile, you've seen the whole thing. All right? So don't do that. As we were riding across the country, all these times, we got into this rhythm as a family of listening to podcasts. And most of the podcasts that we listened to were true crime podcasts. So we listened to this one with, I think her name is Ashley Flowers, and she has a friend who always says, and I'm Britt. And some of you know who Ashley and Britt are, and if you do, they're like family to us now because we have listened to every one of their podcasts at least twice. And most of these podcasts are about serial killers, which is, I know it's kind of a little bit like, why do you listen about, it's interesting. It really is. And I found myself on one of these trips just starting to think, what was it that happened in these people's lives that sent them down this road? Because obviously something somewhere got broken very badly. And then I began to think, what was it that their parents did or didn't do that caused this to happen? Now let me just say this. Children grow up to become adults, and adults make their own decisions, and parents can't be responsible for the decisions that adults make. And sometimes parents might do everything right, and the kid makes bad decisions. That happens. But most of the time, what happens when a child grows up is very significantly influenced by what happened when they were a child. And if you look at serial killers, this is true. For most, if not all serial killers, there's 3 factors in parenting to look for. There's absence, there's overly permissive, and there's abusive. Now, in some of them, all three of those are present. Some it's just two, and some it might just be one. But generally speaking, there's that shared experience as a child that had either an absent, an overly permissive, or an abusive parent, or all of the above. So very simply, if you don't want to have a serial killer as a child, don't do those things, and you'll be set. But my guess is most of you, that's not the standard. Most of you, when your first child was born, your first thought wasn't, boy, above everything else, I hope this child is not a serial killer. No, you had all kinds of hopes and dreams, right? I want my child to grow up. I want them to have lots of friends. I want them to do well in school. I want them to graduate, get a job, have a career, get married, have their own kids. Right? We've got all these dreams for our kids. And the question I want you to chew on this morning is, what are you doing to make those dreams a reality? Now, I know that for many parents, you're doing a lot. Like, I want my kid to grow up and be a Major League Baseball player. So, man, we are out in the backyard every night for 4 hours. I'm throwing baseballs at them because I want them to, become a really good hitter. And we're working on nutrition, and they're hitting the weights and all that. Okay, that's great. And some of you say, I want my child to be a great student. And so beginning at age 2, they're watching Baby Einstein movies, and we're drilling them with flashcards, and they're reading at an 8th grade level when they're 4. And we just do everything we can to make sure they have this great academic career. And that's good. That's fine. But I'm much more concerned for your children about their spiritual development. What I really want to know is, what are you doing as a parent to ensure that your child grows up to know Jesus, to love Jesus, and to follow Jesus for their whole life? And we're going to spend the next 4 weeks talking about that question. What is it that parents can do? And by the way, this isn't just for parents. We're going to talk about all of us in this series. But what is it that we can do to ensure that our kids grow up to know Jesus, to love Jesus, and to follow Jesus their whole life? Let's start in the book of Proverbs. All right, Proverbs chapter 1, verse 8 says, "Hear, my son, your father's instructions, and forsake not your mother's teaching." Now, this is a pretty common proverb. In fact, you go through the book of Proverbs, you'll see something similar to this over and over and over again. And hey, kids, this is good advice. All right, it's good advice to listen to what your parents say. But I want all of us to think about this proverb a little bit differently this morning. Because the reality is, your children cannot listen to your instruction or your teaching if you don't instruct and teach. You see, a lot of times, parents are thinking, I want my kid to grow up, I want them to know Jesus, love Jesus, and follow Jesus, and I hope that they do. And then that's the end of it. There's no plan, there's no intentionality. They're just simply hoping by chance maybe this will happen. Maybe by a happy accident, my kid will grow up to know, love, and obey Jesus. I want you to understand that accident and chance never built anything great. If your only plan for your child's spiritual development is, well, I hope there's a happy accident, or I hope by chance this happens, it's probably not going to happen. You see, for the important things in life, you have to be intentional. You have to have a plan. Now, I'm the kind of person that loves to have a plan. Like, I want to have a plan about everything. In fact, this morning in first service, when Steve got up and did this stuff, I was so mad. I was like, this isn't the plan. Everything is going to get messed up now. Because I live by plans. So many, many years ago, when Mary Ann and I went on our honeymoon, we went to Disney World. And our first morning, we're at the Magic Kingdom, and we get all through the gates, and we're standing there on that Main Street, USA, and you look down at Cinderella's castle, and I grabbed a map, and I opened the map, and I said, all right, what are we going to do? And she kind of looked at me like I was speaking a foreign language. She's like, what do you mean? And I said, well, what's the plan? And she looked at me, she said, what do you mean? I said, well, honey, we got to have a plan. Right? I mean, I don't know, what is it that you want to hit today? Let's get it all mapped out. We'll figure out what we're going to do in the morning, where we're going to have lunch, what we're going to do in the afternoon. And she said, David, we're at Disney World. And at Disney World, you don't have a plan. You just enjoy it. This is one of those moments when you realize, I just married someone very different than me. Right? And I don't know if any of the rest of you have ever experienced that, but I married someone very different than me. And you know what? She was right. And what I discovered was you can have a lot of fun at Disney World without a plan. In fact, sometimes a plan just gets in the way. So I put the map back in my pocket, and I said, well, we'll see how this goes, but just in case, I've got my map. And we walked around, and we never looked at the map. We just had fun. We went where the day took us. We had happy accidents. We had chance happenings, and it was a glorious day. And I learned a really important lesson that you don't always have to have a plan. But you know what? The reason we didn't need a plan at Disney World is because Disney World's not important. See, when it's not important, that's fine. You don't need to have a plan. But when it's important, when it matters, when someone's eternal destiny is at stake, you need to have a plan. You need to be intentional. Now my day came a few years later. We were back at Disney World, this time with our kids. And we were down there with friends and family. And on the last day, we were going to be the only ones still there. And so as we were headed back to our hotel that night, Marianne said, David, tomorrow is your day to shine. I was like, oh, what's happening? She said, I think it would be really cool tomorrow if we tried to hit all 4 parks before we leave. I said, in one day? She said, in one day. And she said, but we're going to need a plan. And I said, well, I am the man with the plan. And so we mapped it all out, and we figured out what we were going to do, what we weren't going to do, and we had the perfect plan, and we executed the perfect plan, and we had a blast. You see, sometimes in life, you don't need a plan, and sometimes in life, you better have a plan. And if it's important, you better have a plan. Listen, someone is going to disciple your children, whether you do it or not. You see, to disciple someone is to teach them to follow. And your children are going to follow something or someone. Regardless of whether you have a plan or not, regardless of whether you choose or not, your children are going to follow someone or something. And if you don't disciple your kids to follow Jesus, someone else is going to disciple them to follow something or someone else. Now, I want to be really careful with how I say this, all right? So I hope you guys will give me some grace and hear this as I mean to say it. We have, in our church, in our country, we have amazing teachers. We have many teachers who absolutely love Jesus, and they are using their position in our schools to point kids to God, and they are doing an amazing job. And there are principals who are doing the same thing, and there are administrators who are doing the same thing. But I want you to hear this. The American educational system does not care if your children love Jesus. And in fact, I would argue that when it comes to the actual system, like every other system in our world, it's the exact opposite. And if you do not disciple your kids, they will. Now, someone who understood this in the Bible was Moses. And if you look in the Old Testament, the book of Deuteronomy is like Moses' last words. He sat down, is near the end of his life, and he wanted to give the people of Israel something to remember. And so Deuteronomy is kind of Moses saying, hey guys, as you head into the promised land without me, here's what you need to take with you. And in the middle of that, Moses includes some really practical advice for parents. And that's really where we're going to spend our time this morning. So if you have your Bible, open it to Deuteronomy chapter 6. All right, Deuteronomy chapter 6, starting in verse 5, it says, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your might. And these words that I command you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. So Moses is giving a lot of details here about what we're going to call this immersive educational experience. But I want you to see his starting point, because he starts by saying, you shall. Okay? He doesn't start by saying the kids shall or the children shall. He says you. Because what he wants the parents to understand is this journey of parenting begins with us. If we don't get ourselves right, we're not going to get our kids right. And what he wants parents to understand is they need to love God. They need to prioritize loving God. Above all other things, love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And then he says, and also God's words should be on your heart. What he's saying is that your life should be oozing with love for God and love for God's word. Now, here's the deal. Your kids know what you love. They do. And your kids know what you don't love. And more likely than not, your kids will grow up to love what you love and to not love what you don't love. I'm a little bit ashamed to say this. And I know that they would never admit it. But I'm afraid that my kids love the Detroit Lions. I mean, the sins of the father have been visited onto the children. They've grown up watching their dad suffer through season after season after season, and yet my undying love for the Honolulu Blue and Silver has been passed on to them. And I'm going to tell you what, this year, when the Lions start winning, they're going to be loudly on that bandwagon. I see some of you doubters. Don't doubt. Our kids love what we love. And if your kids see that you love God and that your heart oozes with love for his word, then there's a really good chance that their life will reflect the same. And so this is where Moses begins. He says, before anything else, you need to love God. And now, once you figured that out, now let's talk about the next part, which is what? Teach them. Teach them diligently. Now, here's the problem. If you don't love God and you don't pass that on to the next generation, it will get lost. After Moses died, Joshua took over as the leader of Israel, and he led Israel into the promised land. And you can read all the book of Joshua, how Joshua conquered all of Canaan. And the people served God during Joshua's time. And at the end of Joshua's life, he gave this stirring speech where he said, you have to choose who you're going to serve. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. He's like, we're passing this thing on to our kids. But then if you go into Judges, the next book, you see what happens after Joshua dies. And let me show you this. This is Judges chapter 2, verse 7. It says, and the people served the Lord all the days of Joshua. So all the time Joshua is alive, that generation, the people who knew Joshua, they served God. And all the days of the elders who outlived Joshua, who had seen all the great work that the Lord had done for Israel. Now notice what this is. This is another generation. They saw what God did under Joshua. So as Joshua and his people are conquering Canaan, their kids are watching. And their kids see what God has done for them. In fact, it says that they continue to serve God. And then it says, and all that generation also were gathered to their fathers. So they all died. And look what happens next. And there arose another generation after them who did not know the Lord or the work that he had done for Israel. Do you see what happened here? You have a generation that conquers Canaan. Right? God does mighty works for them. And then their kids see all of that, and they know about it. But then the next generation doesn't even know. Verse 11, and the people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord and served the Baals. You see how fast that happened? 3 generations. Generation 1, they served God. Generation 2, they saw it, but they never internalized it. Never became who they were. They never prioritized loving God. They had the head knowledge, but they didn't act on it. And as a result, their kids don't even know. Generation 3 serves Baal. So Moses says, look, teach your kids diligently. Now I want you to notice this. This is important. Parents, the Bible places the responsibility for teaching your children on your shoulders. Okay? Let's say that again. The Bible places the responsibility for teaching your children on your shoulders. Now, I understand we can partner with other people to help us teach our kids. That's a wise thing to do. And so you send your kids to school where they can learn from experts about English and science and math and history. That's important because those people know what they're doing. And you send your kids to Sunday school where they can be taught by people who know God and who love God. That's all really important. But understand, at the end of the day, the person who will answer for what your child is taught to God is you. And so you ought to be very concerned. You ought to be very intentional. You ought to have a plan for how you are going to teach your children to know Jesus, to love Jesus, and to follow Jesus. Now, back about 100 years ago, educational theory came up with this idea called the experience pyramid. And the concept is pretty simple. It's basically how you learn something impacts whether or not you remember it. So if you read something, you're less likely to remember it than if you actually hear it. But if you see something, you're more likely to remember it than if you hear it. And if you see and hear it at the same time, you're more likely to remember it than if you just see it or just hear it. And if you write it down or say it yourself, now you're even more likely to remember it. But if you do something, now that's when you're most likely to remember it. Now, about 100 years ago, the experiments pyramid that came out, that's fantastic, that's amazing. All right, let's do that. And I kind of feel like saying, yeah, but Moses was teaching this same thing like 3,000 years earlier. All you had to do is read Deuteronomy. Check out what Moses says. This is Moses talking about the experience pyramid, or this immersive experience education. He says, look, I want you to teach your children when? When you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise, you shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. Moses is saying, look, all the time, everywhere you go, everything you do, teach your kids. This is the plan. This is what it means to be an intentional parent. If you want to disciple your children to love Jesus, this is what it takes. I want to take just a couple of minutes here, and I want to just speak really directly to the parents who are here this morning. Okay? So parents, I'm talking to you for a minute, and we're going to talk very specifically about what you can do to be an intentional parent. I'm going to give you 3 things that you can start this week that will help you in this journey. Number 1, prioritize loving God above everything else. Prioritize loving God above everything else. Imagine if when my kids were young, I gathered them all together and I said, all right, guys, we're going to have this family conference. I want to talk about what we value as a family. What's going to be most important to us? And so I want you to hear this, that for our family, for the 4 Rudds, the most important thing in the world for us to do together is to eat macaroni and cheese. And their eyes get really big because that sounds awesome. Like, all right, we love macaroni and cheese. And Liam says, Dad, are we going to have macaroni and cheese tonight? And I say, well, I actually already ordered a pizza, so tonight we're going to have pizza. But very soon we will have macaroni and cheese. And the next day they come home from school and Emma says, Dad, are we going to have macaroni and cheese tonight? I say, well, you know what? I thawed some chicken, so we're going to grill that up, but we're going to have some mashed potatoes and green beans. It's going to be really, really tasty. Like, okay. They come home from school the next day, and Liam says, Dad, are we going to have macaroni and cheese tonight? I say, well, I thought it would be fun if we had breakfast for dinner. So I'm going to make pancakes. We're going to have bacon. We'll have toast. We'll have eggs, hash browns, the whole 9 yards. Okay? They come. You guys see where this is going, right? At some point, they're going to stop asking about macaroni and cheese. And at some point, they are going to reach the conclusion on their own without me ever telling them that we don't really value macaroni and cheese in our family. I can tell my kids until they're blue in the face that we love God in our family. But if my life doesn't reflect that, they will draw the conclusion all on their own that God's not really a priority for me, and he shouldn't really be a priority for them. So if I say, hey, we're a Christian family, we love Jesus, but my kids watch how I interact with other people, and my words and my attitudes don't reflect the love of Jesus, they're going to draw a conclusion. If I say to my kids, hey, we love Jesus in this house, but the way we spend our time or the way we spend our money doesn't reflect the love of Jesus, they're going to draw their own conclusion. If I say we love God with our heart, soul, mind, and strength in this house, but when hard times come, my reaction doesn't look like the reaction of someone who has faith in God, they're going to draw their own conclusions. You see, if you say we love God, but you don't prioritize loving Him, in your words, your thoughts, your actions, your attitudes, your interactions, your relationships, your kids are going to figure it out really quickly that that's not really important. Number 2, regularly read the Bible with your children. Regularly read the Bible with your children. I remember growing up, we would go up to the Upper Peninsula of Michigan every year and spend some time with my grandparents. And every morning I would wake up and Grandma Linda would make the exact same breakfast. I'd go out, I'd sit at the table, and there would be my plate there, and there would be 2 cups, one with milk and one with orange juice. Except for on really good days, we might have grape juice instead of orange juice, which was awesome. But on the plate, there would always be 1 hard-boiled egg, and then 2 or 3 sausage links, depending on how old you were. And in each link was this little plastic sword that would stick down. So you didn't even need a fork. You just take the sword and pick it up and eat your sausage, right? And then also on the plate, there was always 2 toasted pieces of Finnish coffee bread. Now, if you've never had Finnish coffee bread, you really haven't experienced the joy of the kingdom yet. All right, so you may want to look into that, but my grandmother used to always make it, and it was amazing. But while we were sitting there eating our breakfast, my grandfather would come over to the table, and he would sit down, and he'd open his Bible, and he would read the proverb of the day. Because he wanted us to understand this is important. This is valuable. You need to learn wisdom. You need to learn to love God's word. Now, I know some of you are thinking, well, that sounds great. I'm not sure my kid's ready for the Bible yet. Well, you don't have to read them all the passages, about killing and wars and all that stuff. Stay away from Revelation for a little bit. Some of you, maybe a King James isn't the thing right away, thee, thou, thine, all that kind of stuff. But if your kids are little, get the Jesus Storybook Bible. This is one of the best books you can ever buy. So we read this to our kids when they were little. As a church, we give this away when new families come because we think it's so important. It's just full of wonderful Jesus stories that are illustrated beautifully. They're worded so well. It's a great way to start teaching your kids the value of God's word at a very young age. If you want to be an intentional parent, begin reading the Bible with your child all the time. And number 3, initiate conversations. Moses said, look, you need to talk about God all the time. And he actually walks you through when to do that. He says, talk about God when you're doing activities. Right? He says when you're sitting at home or when you're on the way somewhere. So you got to drive to the soccer field and have a conversation. Look out the window. Look at those trees. Isn't it amazing that God created those? Hey, what do you think it teaches us about God that big oak tree starts from just a little acorn? Look at that sunset. Why do you think it is that God makes every sunset different? What does that tell us about Him? Have these conversations about God. Talk about who He is. Talk about what He's done. Talk about what He expects. Talk about what is the truth about Him. So have these conversations when you're doing activities. Have these conversations in the morning and the evening. Moses says talk about Him when you lie down and when you wake up. So start the day by talking about God. Finish the day by talking about God. Hey, what did God do for you today? Let me tell you what God did for me. We should be thankful. In fact, let's take a minute and pray together and thank God for all that He's done for us. Have these conversations. Have these conversations while you curate your children's entertainment. Let's talk about this for a second. What your kids are taking in is teaching them. In fact, look at this. Moses is super timely. He had no idea about this, but this is amazing. Verse 8 says, you shall bind them as a sign on your hand. So the idea is that they would wrap like a rope around their hand and they would put a Bible verse on it. So that every time you look at your hand, you would see a Bible verse and you would be reminded of the words of God. Now, what we can do today is we can take one little letter in this verse and tweak it just a little bit. And so instead of being worried about what's on your hand, think about what's in your hand. Because parents, what your children hold in their hands most of the time is something that has the power of life and death. It can do great good, and it can do devastating harm. And if you're not paying attention to what they're looking at on their phone, you are missing an opportunity to disciple them. Talk about what they're watching, what they're listening to, who they're talking to, what they're scrolling. Have conversations. Ask them things like, hey, is that true? Would God say that that's true? By the way, week 4 of this series, we're going to talk about how to teach your children to recognize truth, specifically God's truth. All right? But have these conversations. Moses goes on here and he says that they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. Because he's saying, look, parents, pay attention to what your kids are looking at. Now for us, it's what's on the screens, right? Because what's on the screens is teaching them. And let's be honest, what they're seeing on most of the screens in front of them is not teaching them what you want them to know about God. And so you got to be able to have a conversation where you say, you know what, is that true? What do you think God would say about this? What do you think God would do about this? How do you think God would feel about that person? What a wonderful opportunity to just engage your kids in conversations about God. Now, if you're wondering how to do this better, this is a great book right here. You can get it on Amazon. It's called Talking with Your Kids About God. So if you go to Amazon and you're not sure what to search for Talking with Your Kids About God. Okay? Because what are we talking about right now? We're talking about talking with your kids about God. So search for that, find this book. There's a whole series of them, and they're full of conversation starters that you can talk to your kids about God. And it's a powerful way for you to build into their lives. Let me take a minute now and just really quickly talk to those of you who aren't parents, okay? Those of you who aren't parents. Because I know that some of you who are here this morning, you're hearing this and you're thinking, that's great, David, but it's a little bit late for me. Like, my kids are grown. I missed my opportunity. I'm not sure my kids do love Jesus the way I want them to. And all this stuff you're saying, it's fantastic, but it's too late for me. No, it's not. It's never too late. Now, it may be true that you missed an opportunity, but that's the past. You can't change the past, but you can always work on the future. Now, it may be that in your past that your practice was that we're going to hope for a happy accident, right? Maybe you approached parenting and you were very intentional about sports or academics or career, but you weren't very intentional about God, and now you're like, yeah, I wish I had done better with that. There's still time. Now remember, accidents and chance never built anything great. So if that was what you did before, don't keep doing it. It's time to do something different. And maybe that begins with having a conversation. Even if your kids are in their late teens or their 20s or their 30s or their 40s or their 50s, have a conversation where you say, you know, I didn't always live the way I wish I had. I wasn't perfect. I didn't always demonstrate for you the love for God that I wish I had, but beginning today, I'm going to start. And if you're willing to have a conversation about it, I'd love to talk to you about it. And beginning from today on, you can begin to make those kinds of investments even into the lives of your adult children. But let me talk to everybody here, okay? Because what I want all of us to take away today is this idea that someone is going to invest in the children, whether we do or not. You know, Satan understands. He understands that if he can break one generational link, then he will win for generations and generations and generations. And so he wants nothing more than to break that link between you and your children. So that maybe you know about God, but your children don't. And for all of us, this is a challenge for us to say, how can we invest to make sure the next generation of Christ followers knows him and loves him and follows him? One of the ways we can do that is through prayer. We can all pray for the kids, right? So add that to your prayer list. So every morning, every evening, whenever it is that you pray, take some time and pray for the kids. Pray that they'll have courage. Pray that they'll have wisdom. Pray that they won't be afraid. Pray that they'll have endurance, because I'm going to tell you, The kids today are facing things we never dreamed about, and they need our prayers. But they need more than just our prayers. We can also invest with time, with energy. We have a great kids program here at The Gathering, and if you don't work in the kids program, I'd love for you to think about it, even if it's just once a month or once every 2 months. I mean, maybe all you're going to do is sit and rock babies, but how awesome is that? Or maybe you can be the snack provider. Everybody loves the person who brings snacks. Whatever it might do, think about, how can I invest my time and energy there? You can invest in our student ministries. I mean, they were all in here with us earlier today. You can invest in it. Some of you are saying, I don't want to work with the teens. They scare me. That's fine. They scare me too. All right? But you know what? They all eat. And because they all eat, they always need food. So you can be someone who brings food or makes food. Maybe you love to cook. Cook for teenagers. Just write a note on your connection card today and say, hey, I will cook for the kids. And we'll make sure somebody reaches out to you and helps you know how to do that. You know, your financial investments go towards the next generation. I don't like to talk about money a lot, but every so often it's good to remind you that anytime you give money to the gathering, a portion of that money goes to the next generation. It goes to hiring staff, to purchasing resources, to paying for kids to go to activities and events and retreats and camps. And so when you make a financial investment here, you're making a financial investment in the next generation. We can all invest in the next generation. I know that sometimes we can look at the kids today and say, boy, I'm not sure there's any hope left. I mean, we see the rising suicide rates. We see the anxiety, the depression that they're dealing with. We see the drug overdoses, the opioid epidemic. We see schools being shot up. We see the sexual confusion and perversion that they're being exposed to. And it's easy to say, is there really any hope? Hear me today, there's hope. If we are willing to step forward as parents, as grandparents, as aunts, as uncles, as friends, as neighbors, as simply followers of God, if we are willing to step forward and make the investments, then we can partner together with God and discover that it's not too late to save the kids. Let's start by praying for them. Father.